Story number 1. Footsteps on the Roof. Christmas Eve, 2015. I remember it like it was yesterday, though it's been years now. I was alone in our old house in rural Oregon, a sprawling farmhouse nestled at the edge of a dense forest. My family had gone to visit relatives in the south, leaving me with the responsibility of keeping the home warm and festive. At 22, I prided myself on being independent, but that night, as the wind howled outside and the snow began to fall in earnest, I questioned just how alone I truly was. The house was a relic from another time, with creaky wooden floors and large windows that framed the surrounding wilderness like paintings. Inside, the living room was a beacon of warmth and light. The Christmas tree stood tall, adorned with twinkling lights, glass ornaments, and a star that seemed to glow with its own inner light. I sat on the worn leather couch, a mug of hot cocoa cradled in my hands, listening to the familiar strains of Bing Crosby's White Christmas, emanating from the old radio perched on the mantel. There was something comforting about the routine, the way the music filled the room, the smell of cinnamon from the candles, the soft crackle of the fireplace. It was a perfect, peaceful night, or so I thought. Then I heard it. At first, it was just a faint noise, barely distinguishable from the sounds of the storm outside. A subtle creak, like the house settling, or perhaps a branch scraping against the siding. I glanced up at the ceiling, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shaking off the unease, I returned to my cocoa, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct. Footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that echoed through the attic space above. My heart began to race as I strained to listen, the festive music now a stark contrast to the sinister rhythm overhead. Probably just a raccoon, I muttered to myself, attempting to quell the rising panic. But deep down, I knew it wasn't an animal. Raccoons are curious, yes, but they're not known for persistent prowling on rooftops, especially not in the dead of winter. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. The operator answered with a calm, professional voice that did little to soothe my frayed nerves. 911. What's your emergency? There are footsteps on my roof, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Someone is up there. There was a brief pause, filled only by the sound of distant thunder and the relentless storm outside. Ma'am, can you see anyone on your roof? No, I don't think so, I stammered. But the footsteps, they're real. The operator assured me help was on the way and instructed me to stay calm and keep an eye on the situation. I glanced around the room, trying to steady my breathing. The warmth of the fireplace contrasted sharply with the chill that settled over me. A chill that wasn't entirely due to the storm. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every second amplifying the tension. Then, just as I began to relax, the footsteps stopped abruptly. Silence enveloped the house, oppressive and thick. I held my breath, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Perhaps the intruder had left. I hoped, trying to convince myself. When the police arrived, they were efficient and thorough. A squad car's lights flashed through the windows as officers made their way up to the roof, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They searched meticulously, checking the attic, the chimney, even the roof itself, but found nothing. No footprints in the snow, no signs of forced entry, nothing to explain the unnerving sounds I had heard. Relief began to seep into my veins as they departed, assuring me that the house was secure. Yet, that relief was short-lived. As I made my way upstairs to my bedroom, a lingering sense of dread hung over me. The hallway was dimly lit, shadows dancing on the walls from the flickering lights. Entering my room, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The window was slightly ajar, despite my certainty that I had closed it before the night. Snowflakes had drifted inside, settling on the windowsill and casting a frosty pattern on the glass. I approached cautiously, my mind racing with possibilities. That's when I saw it, a smeared handprint on the window frame. It was dark and dirty, as if someone had pressed their hand against the glass in a desperate attempt to break through. My breath caught in my throat, and I reached out, touching the cold, sticky residue. The fingers were unnaturally long, twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. It wasn't human, at least, not entirely. I recoiled, heart pounding in my chest. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. I backed away from the window, the reality of the situation sinking in. Someone or something had tried to get in. But who? Or what? Sleep was a distant hope as I lay in bed, every creak of the house amplified by my heightened senses. The storm continued to rage outside, a relentless reminder of my isolation. Thoughts of the police's search lingered, but no rational explanation could dispel the fear that had taken root in my mind. Hours passed before dawn broke, casting a weak light through the curtains. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but sleep remained elusive. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the darkness, I finally drifted into a restless slumber. I awoke to the sound of soft humming. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The same melody from the radio downstairs. I sat up, listening intently. The humming seemed to come from the attic. My heart skipped a beat. Had I heard it wrong? Or was it something else? Mustering all my courage, I got out of bed and made my way downstairs. The living room was bathed in the gentle light of morning, the tree still adorned with decorations that now seemed almost eerie in the daylight. The radio was off, yet the humming persisted, a ghostly echo of the night before. I followed the sound to the attic door. It stood slightly ajar, just as the window had been. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The attic was cluttered with old boxes and forgotten memories, the air thick with dust. The humming was louder here, a melancholic tune that seemed to seep into my very bones. As I moved further into the attic, the humming ceased abruptly. Silence reclaimed the space, oppressive and heavy. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a figure standing in the far corner. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was indistinct, a shadow among shadows, but there was no denying the presence. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to run, to flee from whatever haunted this place, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to fade, dissolving into the shadows until there was nothing left but the empty attic and the lingering sense of dread. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, before finally finding the strength to leave. Days passed, and the memory of that night began to fade, replaced by the normal rhythms of daily life. Yet, the feeling of being watched never quite left me. I tried to dismiss it as residual fear, a lingering effect of the storm and the unknown. But then, on Christmas Day, as I was unpacking the tree decorations, I noticed something strange. One of the ornaments, a delicate glass angel, was missing. Puzzled, I searched the attic, only to find it lying on the floor, shattered into 1,000 pieces. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't just the angel that had been disturbed. The whole tree was slightly disheveled, as if someone had been there, moving among the branches. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was haunting the house wasn't done with me yet. That presence was still there, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Weeks turned into months, and the unsettling occurrences continued. Doors would open and close on their own. Objects moved without explanation, and the sense of being watched never abated. I began to research the history of the house, hoping to find some clue as to why I was being targeted. What I discovered sent chills down my spine. The farmhouse had a dark past, with tales of tragedy and unexplained disappearances dating back decades. Locals whispered about restless spirits and curses that plagued the property. But I had always dismissed these stories as mere folklore. Now, faced with the inexplicable, I couldn't deny the possibility that something otherworldly was at play. determined to put an end to the torment. I sought the help of a local medium, an elderly woman named Margaret who was reputed to have a connection to the spiritual realm. Margaret arrived on a chilly evening, her presence both comforting and formidable. She walked through the house, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. After a thorough examination, she turned to me, her expression grave. "This house is haunted by a restless spirit," she said softly. "Someone who was deeply wronged, unable to find peace, has been trying to reach out, to communicate." I felt a mix of fear and determination. "What can we do to help it move on?" Margaret explained that a ritual of cleansing and acknowledgement was necessary, a way to honor the spirit's memory and offer it the peace it sought. Together, we prepared the house, lighting candles and arranging items that might hold significance to the spirit. As night fell, we began the ritual. Margaret chanted softly, her voice blending with the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the storm. I felt a presence around me, a heaviness that pressed against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the candles flickered wildly. The humming returned, louder this time, mingling with whispers that seemed to come from all around. I closed my eyes, focusing on Margaret's words, willing the spirit to accept our gesture. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the turmoil ceased. The air grew still, the temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I opened my eyes to see Margaret smiling gently. "It's done," she said. "The spirit can finally rest." Relief washed over me, but so did a lingering sense of melancholy. I knew that the house would never be the same, that the veil between our world and whatever lay beyond had been momentarily lifted. But for now, peace had been restored. Christmas Day turned into a time of reflection, a reminder of the thin line between the living and the dead. I continued to live in the farmhouse, but the eerie occurrences ceased, replaced by a newfound sense of calm. The tree no longer seemed haunted. The windows no longer held sinister marks. Yet, sometimes, late at night when the wind howls and the house settles, I can still hear faint footsteps on the roof, a gentle reminder of the night when the past reached out to touch the present. And while I no longer fear what lies beyond, I remain ever vigilant, respecting the mysteries that exist just out of sight, in the shadows of the familiar. In the end, that Christmas taught me more than I ever expected. It taught me about the unseen connections that bind us, the lingering echoes of lives once lived, and the importance of acknowledging the restless souls who seek peace. And as the years go by, whenever the snow begins to fall and the nights grow long, I'm reminded of that night, a night when the footsteps on the roof changed my life forever. Story number 2. The Man in the Window, Christmas Eve, 2009. I still remember that night vividly. The way the cold bit into my bones and the silence seemed almost too thick to breathe. My name is Elena, and for as long as I can remember, I cherished the solitude of my Michigan home during the holidays. While my family reveled in bustling gatherings and endless cheer, I found comfort in the quiet, in the soft glow of twinkling lights reflecting off freshly fallen snow. Our house was a modest, two-story affair nestled at the edge of a small town, surrounded by dense woods that blanketed the landscape in white each winter. The scent of pine from the Christmas tree mingled with the aroma of cinnamon and vanilla from the baking cookies I had spent the afternoon preparing. I had decorated meticulously, every ornament placed with care, every string of lights untangled and perfectly aligned. Tonight was mine alone, and I intended to savor every peaceful moment. I settled into my favorite armchair by the window, a cup of hot cocoa warming my hands. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. Bing Crosby's White Christmas played softly in the background, its nostalgic melody filling the space with a sense of timeless serenity. I took a sip, letting the rich chocolate soothe my senses, and gazed out at the snowfall. The world outside was a picturesque winter wonderland, the snowflakes twinkling like tiny stars under the streetlights. The town was quiet, the usual hustle and bustle stilled by the blanket of snow. I felt a sense of contentment, wrapped in the tranquility that only a snowy Christmas Eve could bring. Then, without warning, a chill swept through the room, causing the fire to flicker and the cocoa to spill slightly from my mug. I glanced around, puzzled by the sudden drop in temperature. The room was still, the only sound the persistent crackle of the fire and the distant hum of traffic muffled by the snowstorm raging outside. As I turned my attention back to the window, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. It was subtle at first, a nagging sense that I wasn't alone. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But then I saw him. A man stood outside, directly across the street from my house, staring intently through my window. His presence was jarring against the otherwise serene backdrop. He was tall, clad in a dark overcoat that seemed to swallow the dim light, his face obscured by shadows. His eyes, however, were unmistakable, piercing and unblinking, fixated on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back. Eyes locked on the figure outside. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my gaze away. The man remained motionless, a silent sentinel in the snowy night. I considered calling out to him, but my voice caught in my throat. Panic began to rise as I realized he wasn't moving closer, just standing there, watching. Instinctively, I reached for the door, fumbling with the lock in a state of mounting fear. My hands trembled uncontrollably, making the task nearly impossible. Finally, with a desperate twist, I managed to secure the door, my breath shallow and rapid. I grabbed my phone, fingers numb from the cold, and dialed 911, my voice barely above a whisper. 911. What's your emergency? There's someone outside my window, I stammered, my voice cracking. A man. He's watching me. There was a brief pause, filled only by the sound of the storm outside. Ma'am, stay on the line. We're sending help right now. I could hear the distant wail of sirens approaching, a small comfort amidst the rising tide of fear. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Was it a prank? A stalker? But why now? On Christmas Eve? The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. The sirens grew louder, their urgency cutting through the howling wind. Soon, the flashing lights of the police cruiser illuminated the snowy street, casting long shadows across the pavement. 2 officers approached my home, their expressions a mix of concern and professionalism. Ma'am, what's going on? One of them asked, his flashlight beam sweeping the exterior of my house. I saw a man outside my window, I replied, my voice wavering. He was watching me. The officers exchanged a glance before one of them nodded. We'll check it out. Stay inside and stay safe. They moved towards the window, their steps crunching on the fresh snow. I watched anxiously as they approached, my eyes darting back to where the man had been standing. But he was gone, vanished without a trace. The officers began a methodical search of the area, combing through the snow with flashlights, looking for any sign of the mysterious figure. After what felt like an eternity, they returned, their faces unreadable. Ma'am, we didn't find anyone out there. The lead officer reported. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. It seems he just disappeared into the night. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As the officers left, I couldn't shake the lingering unease that settled back into my bones. I retreated to my armchair, trying to calm my racing heart. But the image of those piercing eyes haunted me. I glanced out the window again, half expecting to see him there. But the street was empty, the snow undisturbed. Deciding to put the incident behind me, I attempted to relax, but sleep eluded me. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, amplified my anxiety. The man in the window had left an indelible mark on my sense of safety, transforming my sanctuary into a place of fear. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that Christmas Eve lingered like a shadow. I avoided staying alone during the holidays, seeking the company of friends and family to stave off the dread that had taken root. Yet, no matter how hard I tried, the image of his unblinking gaze would surface at the most unexpected moments. A reminder of that fateful night, I delved into research, desperate to understand who he might have been. Local newspapers yielded nothing, no reports of break-ins or missing persons matching his description. It was as if he had materialized out of thin air, a ghostly presence with no origin. One evening, driven by a need for closure, I returned to the site where I had seen him. The street was deserted. The snow now slushed from the storm's fury. I stood across the road from my house, peering through the cold glass of my window. The streetlights cast a warm glow on the snow, but there was no sign of him. As I turned to leave, a flicker caught my eye. There, etched into the frost-covered glass, was a single word: return. My breath hitched, and I spun around, scanning the street. There he was again, the man in the window, his eyes just as intense, his presence as unnerving as before. This time, he took a step forward, and I felt a chill that wasn't from the winter air. "Why are you here?" I demanded, my voice stronger despite the fear. He didn't respond, but his stance shifted, as if urging me to follow. Compelled by a mix of terror and curiosity, I approached the door, unlocking it with shaky hands. The cold air rushed in as I opened the door, and without thinking, I stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked towards him, each step echoing in the silent night. He remained motionless, his gaze fixed on me. As I drew closer, I noticed something unsettling: a faded name tag on his coat, barely legible. "Michael! Michael!" I called out, hoping for some recognition, but he remained silent. Suddenly, the wind picked up, swirling the snow around us, obscuring his figure. When the storm subsided, he was gone, leaving me alone in the empty street once more. Confusion and fear battled within me. Who was Michael? Why did he choose me? The questions spiraled, leaving me with more dread than answers. I returned home, locking the door firmly, but the night's events replayed endlessly in my mind. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the encounter left an unshakable mark. I couldn't escape the feeling that Michael's presence was somehow intertwined with my own, that our paths were connected in ways I couldn't comprehend. One Christmas Eve, years later, I found myself alone once more. The memory of that first encounter haunted me, the unanswered questions festering into an obsession. Determined to uncover the truth, I revisited old records, spoke to neighbors, and delved into the town's history. What I discovered was a tale of tragedy and loss. Michael Thompson, a man who had lived in my house decades earlier, had vanished on Christmas Eve. Much like my own experience, rumors of foul play swirled, but no evidence ever surfaced, and his disappearance remained a cold case. The realization hit me hard. Michael was not a mere figment of my imagination, but a restless spirit bound to the place he once called home. His unresolved fate mirrored my own, creating a connection that transcended time. Armed with this knowledge, I sought to find peace for both of us. I contacted a local medium, hoping to communicate with Michael and help him find closure. The evening of our session, the house was filled with the same warmth and light I had cherished for so long, but an undercurrent of tension lingered. The medium, a serene woman named Margaret, guided me through the process, her voice a calming presence. As we invoked the spirits of the past, the air grew thick with energy. I felt a presence beside me, a whisper of cold air and the faint scent of pine. The room seemed to hum with unspoken words, and I knew Michael was there, seeking resolution. Through the medium, I conveyed my desire to understand, to help him move on. Images of his life flashed before my eyes, moments of joy, glimpses of sorrow, and the final, desperate night when he vanished without a trace. It became clear that Michael's spirit was trapped, unable to let go of the life he once knew. As the ritual concluded, a sense of calm settled over the house. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, the lingering fear replaced by a bittersweet sense of closure. Michael's presence, once a source of terror, had transformed into a memory deserving of peace. That Christmas Eve, I learned that sometimes the shadows of the past reach out to touch the present, seeking understanding and release. The man in the window was no longer a figure of fear but a reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring bonds that transcend even death. From that night on, I never stayed alone on Christmas Eve, not out of fear, but out of respect for the stories that linger in the corners of our lives. The house remained a sanctuary of light and warmth, its windows reflecting the memories of those who had come before, and the spirit of Michael Thompson finally found the peace he had long sought. Story number 3. Shadows in the Hallway. Christmas 1994. The snow fell thick and relentless, blanketing the small town of Millwood, Michigan, in a pristine layer of white. My parents had decided to leave me alone for the first time during the holidays. They were busy with last-minute shopping, preparing for the family gathering that was a staple of our Christmas tradition. At 12 years old, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The house was warm and inviting, adorned with twinkling lights and the scent of pine from the towering Christmas tree in the living room. I remember that evening vividly. After dinner, my parents had gone out to finish their shopping, leaving me with strict instructions. No one else was to come into the house, and I was to call them if anything unusual happened. With their departure, the house seemed to settle into a comforting silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the soft hum of Christmas music playing from the radio. I decided to play with my collection of Christmas toys, meticulously arranged on a shelf near the hallway. These weren't just any toys. They were heirlooms, passed down through generations, each one holding a story of its own. As I carefully moved a vintage tin soldier, I glanced up at the hallway mirror, a full-length mirror that reflected the entire corridor stretching from the living room to my bedroom. That's when I saw it. A shadow. At first, it was just a faint outline, barely noticeable against the backdrop of the hallway. But as I watched, the shadow began to move, gliding smoothly along the wall. It was the silhouette of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence unnerving in its stillness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I rubbed my eyes, thinking perhaps the dim lighting or my overactive imagination was playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, the shadow was still there, now moving toward the end of the hallway. I called out, hoping my parents had returned early, their voices providing comfort. "Mom? Dad?" Silence. Only the sound of the snowfall outside answered me back. My pulse quickened. I stood up, clutching the tin soldier tightly, and approached the mirror cautiously. The shadow was no longer confined to the wall. It seemed to seep from the edges of the mirror itself, as if the reflection was a portal to another dimension. I took a step back, my mind racing. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice wavering. No response. The shadow continued its slow, deliberate movement, passing by the mirror and disappearing into the living room. I followed its movement, my curiosity overcoming my fear. The living room was dimly lit, the Christmas tree casting eerie shadows that danced in the flickering light. The shadow lingered near the base of the tree, its form indistinct but undeniably human. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the edge of the tree. The shadow seemed to react, turning its head in my direction. My breath caught in my throat as I locked eyes with the dark figure. It was as if the man in the shadow was trying to communicate, his presence both compelling and terrifying. "Please, help me," the shadow seemed to whisper, though no sound escaped his lips. I stumbled back, tripping over a toy train that had been left out of place. The tin soldier flew from my hand, shattering against the wall. My parents would be furious, but right now, All I could think about was the mysterious shadow and the unsettling feeling that something was very wrong. Determined to understand what I was witnessing, I decided to follow the shadow. It moved toward the back of the house, leading me to the attic, a place I rarely ventured. The attic was cluttered with old boxes, forgotten memories, and the remnants of past Christmases. As I climbed the creaky stairs, the temperature seemed to drop, a chill enveloping me despite the warmth below. The shadow stood at the far end of the attic. Motionless, I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadow extended a hand, palm open as if offering something. I reached out tentatively, but my hand passed through the darkness. "I need help," the shadow seemed to convey again. Frustration and fear battled within me. I glanced around, searching for clues. An old mirror leaned against the wall, much like the one in the hallway. As I looked into it, the shadow's reflection mirrored my actions, standing still and reaching out. "Why are you here?" I demanded, my voice cracking. A sudden gust of wind swept through the attic, extinguishing the single light bulb that hung overhead. Darkness enveloped me, and for a moment, I couldn't see anything. Then, the bulb flickered back to life, and the shadow was gone. Panic set in. I rushed downstairs, nearly tripping over a pile of holiday decorations. The house felt different now, no longer the safe haven it once was. I grabbed the phone, intending to call my parents, but realized with a start that I had no signal. Our landline was dead. Desperate, I decided to search the house for any sign of the shadow's origin. Back in the living room, I examined the decorations more closely. Behind the tree, partially concealed by branches, I discovered an old photograph. It was a picture of my grandparents on Christmas Eve, taken many years ago. They were smiling, surrounded by family, the same house in the background. But something was off. In the reflection of the window behind them stood a man I didn't recognize. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his face stern and sorrowful. My grandparents never mentioned him, and I had never seen this man before. "Who is he?" I whispered to myself, a chill running down my spine. I showed the photo to my parents when they returned, but they were puzzled. "That's Grandpa's old friend, Samuel," my father explained. "He passed away a few years before you were born. We never really talked about him much." I felt a shiver. Was the shadow connected to Samuel? The idea seemed far-fetched, but the events of the night couldn't be ignored. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Objects moved on their own. Whispers echoed through the halls, and the shadow seemed to reappear intermittently, always watching, always waiting. My parents dismissed it as my imagination or perhaps residual stress from the holidays. But I knew there was something more sinister at play. Determined to uncover the truth, I delved into family history. I discovered that Samuel had been a close friend of my grandfather, sharing many Christmases together. However, one year, Samuel had mysteriously disappeared on Christmas Eve, never to be seen again. Rumors swirled about his disappearance. Some said he had left town. Others whispered darker theories, but nothing was ever confirmed. As Christmas approached again the following year, the atmosphere in the house grew tense. The shadow's presence intensified, becoming more frequent and more aggressive. Doors slammed shut on their own. Windows rattled despite the absence of wind, and the feeling of being constantly watched weighed heavily on me. One particularly cold night, as I lay in bed trying to ignore the unsettling noises, I heard footsteps in the hallway. My heart raced as I watched the shadow materialize at the foot of my bed, his eyes fixed on mine. "Help me," he pleaded, his voice echoing in my mind. Tears welled up as I realized the shadow was Samuel, trapped between worlds, seeking closure. Summoning all my courage, I spoke softly. "What happened to you, Samuel?" The shadow seemed to hesitate, then began to move toward the attic once more. "I can't move on. There's unfinished business." Understanding dawned on me. Samuel needed something, perhaps recognition, or maybe a way to remember him properly. The next day, I approached my parents with the information I had gathered. After some initial skepticism, they agreed to help me perform a small ceremony in the attic, hoping to provide peace for Samuel's restless spirit. That Christmas Eve, we gathered in the attic, surrounded by the memories of past holidays. My father spoke gently, recounting stories of Samuel and his friendship with my grandfather. My mother brought out a photo album, displaying pictures of happy times shared together. As we spoke, the temperature in the attic dropped noticeably, and the shadows deepened. Suddenly, the shadow of Samuel appeared once more, his form more defined than ever. This time, he didn't reach out but stood silently, observing us. My father continued to speak, sharing heartfelt memories and acknowledging Samuel's presence. It was a moment of connection, bridging the gap between the living and the dead. As the ceremony concluded, the air in the attic seemed to lighten, the oppressive feeling lifted, replaced by a sense of calm. Samuel's shadow faded, leaving behind a peaceful stillness. In the weeks that followed, the strange occurrences ceased. The house returned to its familiar warmth, and the feeling of being watched was gone. My parents noticed a change in me as well, less anxious, more at peace. Years later, the memory of that Christmas lingered, a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the next. I realized that sometimes, the past reaches out to the present, seeking understanding and closure, and while the shadow in the hallway was gone, its presence had taught me the importance of acknowledging those who came before us, ensuring their stories are remembered and their spirits can find peace. That Christmas, I learned that even in solitude, we are never truly alone. The echoes of the past linger, waiting to be heard, and sometimes, all it takes is a little compassion to bridge the divide. Story number 4. The Strange Gift Box. Christmas 2018 was supposed to be a time of peace and solitude for me. Living alone in my modest San Francisco apartment had its perks: quiet nights, complete control over my space, and the freedom to decorate my home exactly how I wanted. The city, with its vibrant lights and festive decorations, provided the perfect backdrop for my solitary celebrations. But nothing could have prepared me for the unnerving experience that would turn my peaceful holiday into a nightmare. It was December 24th, a chilly evening with the fog rolling in from the bay, muffling the sounds of the bustling city. I had spent the day preparing for Christmas, hanging lights on my balcony, arranging ornaments on my small tree, and baking cookies that filled my apartment with the comforting scent of vanilla and cinnamon. As night fell, I settled into my favorite armchair with a cup of hot cocoa, ready to enjoy the quiet night ahead. That's when I noticed it. A plain brown box sitting conspicuously on my doorstep. It was odd, to say the least. I never ordered anything unusual during the holidays, and I didn't expect any unexpected visitors. Curiosity piqued. I approached the door, the sound of my footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. The box was about the size of a shoebox, with no markings or labels to indicate its sender. My name wasn't written on it, nor was there any return address. Just a simple, unassuming package left outside my door. I hesitated for a moment, contemplating whether to take it inside, but the festive spirit, combined with a sense of intrigue, overcame my reservations. I picked up the box, feeling the weight of its contents. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, hinting that something substantial was inside. As I turned around, I saw no one watching me. The street was quiet, the only movement coming from the occasional passerby wrapped in thick coats, hurrying home to escape the cold. Back inside, I placed the box on the coffee table, my mind racing with possibilities. Who could have sent it? Friends or family? No, I was single, without close relatives nearby. Perhaps a neighbor? But I had never interacted much with anyone beyond polite greetings. The thought made me uneasy, but my curiosity was too strong to resist. Carefully, I cut open the box with a pair of scissors. The paper tore easily, revealing the contents within. There was an old photograph, slightly yellowed with age, depicting my very own apartment building from years ago, before I had moved in. The photo was grainy, but I could clearly see the familiar structure, adorned with Christmas decorations much like the ones I had just set up. What was even more unsettling was the handwritten note attached to the back. "I am always watching you." A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the photograph and the ominous message. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a surge of anxiety wash over me. Who would send such a thing? And why now? Pushing the box aside, I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was a prank, someone trying to scare me, but the thought seemed too personal, too targeted. I reached for my phone to call a friend, but before I could dial, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly approached to investigate. Peering through the curtains, I saw nothing unusual, just the dim glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. Relieved yet still on edge, I returned to the living room, attempting to calm my racing thoughts, but the sense of being watched lingered, making it hard to focus on anything else. I decided to call the police, hoping they could shed some light on the mysterious package. Dialing 911, I kept my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. "Hello, this is Elena. I received an unusual package on my doorstep tonight. There's a photo of my apartment building from years ago and a note that says, 'I am always watching you. I don't know who sent this, and I'm feeling quite uneasy about it.'" The dispatcher assured me that they would send someone to check it out. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering dread. As I waited for the police to arrive, I couldn't help but glance repeatedly at the box on the table, now empty except for the photo and note. When the officers finally arrived, they were courteous and professional. One of them, Officer Ramirez, took the photo and read the note carefully. "We'll look into this, ma'am," he said, his expression serious. "Have you noticed anything unusual around your building? Any strangers or suspicious activity?" I shook my head. "No, nothing out of the ordinary. I live alone, and there's not much foot traffic here." Officer Ramirez nodded, assuring me that they would patrol the area and review any available surveillance footage. After a thorough search, they found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no surveillance cameras nearby that could have captured the delivery of the box. It was as if the package had appeared out of thin air. With no immediate leads, the officers left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The night seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening as the hours passed. I tried to distract myself by watching TV and sipping my cocoa, but every creak and groan of the old building heightened my anxiety. Around midnight, I decided to take a short walk to clear my head. Bundling up in my warmest coat, I stepped out into the crisp night air, the city lights casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. The streets were quiet, the usual holiday hustle subdued by the late hour. As I walked past my apartment building, I glanced up at the windows, half expecting to see someone watching me, but they were empty, just like the evening before. Shaking off the lingering fear, I continued my stroll, the rhythmic crunch of snow under my boots providing a soothing cadence. Returning home, I entered cautiously, the warmth of my apartment a stark contrast to the chilly night outside. I closed the door behind me, locking it securely, and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. As I reached for my phone to call it a night, I noticed something odd. A small, delicate ornament from my Christmas tree was missing. Confused, I approached the tree, scanning the branches for any sign of the misplaced decoration. My eyes settled on a small, dusty corner of the room where I rarely ventured. There, partially hidden beneath the tree, was the missing ornament, but it was no ordinary decoration. It was an antique glass angel, one that I had inherited from my grandmother, a family heirloom passed down through generations. What struck me as odd was that the angel's face seemed slightly distorted, its glass surface reflecting the room in an almost otherworldly manner. As I reached out to pick it up, a sudden gust of wind blew through the open window, causing the tree lights to flicker and the room to plunge into semi-darkness. The air grew heavy, and an unsettling silence enveloped me. I turned around, feeling a presence behind me. My heart raced as I slowly turned to face the source of the sensation. Standing there, just a few feet away, was the figure of a man. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, reminiscent of a bygone era, his eyes hollow and staring, his expression unreadable, frozen in place. I stared back at him, unable to speak or move. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening around us. He took a step forward, his movements deliberate and slow, as if he were gliding rather than walking. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. He didn't respond, but the air around him shimmered, and the faint sound of a child's laughter echoed through the room. I felt a chill run down my spine, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The man raised his hand, pointing towards the photograph in the box. I glanced back at the photo, my mind racing. It was my apartment building, but from decades ago. Who was he? And why was he connected to this place? Before I could gather my thoughts, the room plunged into complete darkness as the power went out, leaving me in pitch blackness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, the screen illuminating my desperate search for answers. But as I tried to unlock the door, I found myself unable to move, my body seemingly paralyzed by fear. The man's presence intensified, the air thick with an oppressive energy. I could feel his gaze piercing through me, a silent plea for something I couldn't comprehend. The laughter grew louder, more haunting, filling the room with an eerie ambience, summoning every ounce of courage. I forced myself to speak again. "What do you want?" This time, his voice echoed in my mind, clear and sorrowful. "Help me." Understanding dawned on me. This was no ordinary haunting. There was a story here, a tragedy that needed to be unraveled. Determined to find answers, I broke free from the invisible restraints, my heart pounding as I searched the room for any clues. The man was gone, leaving behind only the lingering sense of his presence and the shattered glass angel lying on the floor. Kneeling beside it, I picked up the delicate ornament, its fragility a stark contrast to the turmoil it represented. As I held it, images flashed before my eyes, visions of a young family celebrating Christmas, laughter filling the air, and then darkness descending as tragedy struck. I realized that the photograph and the message were not random acts of intimidation but pieces of a puzzle begging to be solved. Driven by a need to help, I delved into the history of my apartment building, scouring old records and speaking with longtime residents. What I uncovered was a story of loss and sorrow, a family that had lived in my very apartment decades ago, victims of a tragic fire on Christmas Eve, leaving behind only memories and unanswered questions. The man's presence was tied to that tragedy, his spirit unable to find peace, forever lingering in the place he once called home. Determined to bring closure, I sought the help of a local medium, hoping to communicate with him and help him move on. The medium, a woman named Margaret, arrived the next day, her presence calming yet commanding. She listened intently as I recounted the events, her eyes reflecting a deep understanding of the spiritual realm. Together, we performed a ritual of remembrance, honoring the lost family and acknowledging the lingering spirit seeking peace. As we concluded the ceremony, a profound sense of calm settled over the apartment. The temperature rose, and the oppressive energy dissipated, replaced by a warm, comforting glow. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, the fear and anxiety that had gripped me finally easing. That Christmas, I learned that some spirits linger not out of malice but out of a desperate need for remembrance and closure. The strange gift box had been a catalyst, a bridge between the living and the dead, urging me to uncover the hidden stories that reside within the walls we call home. In the years that followed, I never received another mysterious package, nor did I experience any supernatural occurrences. My apartment remained a sanctuary of light and warmth, the shadows now holding only the memories of a past that had been acknowledged and respected. The man in the window was no longer a figure of fear but a reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding, even towards those who have long since departed. As the holiday season approaches each year, I decorate my tree with a newfound appreciation for the stories behind each ornament, honoring both the living and the spirits that may linger, seeking peace in the quiet moments of Christmas night. Story number 5. The Door That Wouldn't Stay Closed. Christmas Eve, 1987. Was supposed to be a quiet night. I had decided to stay home alone, an act of defiance against my children's well-meaning but overbearing insistence that I couldn't handle myself anymore. 68. I wasn't exactly spry, but I was fiercely independent. I loved my little house nestled in the snowy hills of Colorado, a sturdy structure my late husband, Henry, and I had bought 30 years ago. It held every memory of our lives together, and I wasn't ready to give it up, even for a few nights. The evening was peaceful at first. Snow fell steadily, muffling the world outside. I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing a modest Christmas Eve dinner: roast chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes. Bing Crosby crooned softly from the old radio on the counter, his voice warm and familiar. The house smelled of rosemary and butter, and for a moment, I felt completely content. Then the front door opened. It wasn't just a creak or a shift from the wind. I heard the distinct sound of the lock clicking open, followed by the groaning hinges as the heavy wooden door swung wide. The cold winter air rushed in, biting against my skin even from the kitchen. I froze, the carving knife still in my hand. My first thought was that one of my children had decided to stop by, perhaps to check on me. But when I called out, "Who's there?" no one answered. Gripping the knife tightly, I moved cautiously toward the door. The hallway leading to it felt impossibly long, the dim glow of the porch light casting distorted shadows on the walls. When I reached the entryway, the door was wide open, revealing the snowy darkness outside. Not a soul in sight. The porch light illuminated only the swirling snowflakes and the faint outlines of trees in the distance. My heart pounded as I shut the door firmly, twisting the lock to ensure it was secure. I even gave it a tug to confirm it wouldn't budge. Satisfied, I turned back toward the kitchen. The moment I stepped away, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of the lock turning, followed by the door creaking open. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The door was wide open once more, the cold air cutting through the warmth of the house. My hands trembled as I approached it, this time with more urgency. Slamming it shut, I bolted the lock and leaned against the door, trying to steady my nerves. "It's just the wind," I whispered to myself, though I didn't believe it. The wind couldn't unlock a deadbolt. Still, I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself that the old house was simply showing its age. But then it happened again. And again. Each time I turned away, the door would unlock and swing open, as if something or someone was deliberately taunting me. My unease grew into outright fear. I could feel it now, a presence, invisible but oppressive, lurking in the house with me. It was as though the air had changed, becoming thicker, heavier. "Henry," I muttered under my breath, a desperate plea to my late husband. "If you're here, give me a sign." But the house remained silent, save for the groaning door as it swung open yet again. This time, I didn't close it. I simply stood there, staring out into the night, my breath visible in the cold air. The snow glowed faintly under the moonlight, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move among the trees. It was fleeting, barely there, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Then I heard the laughter. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable, a soft, chilling giggle that echoed from the direction of the kitchen. My blood ran cold as I realized it couldn't have come from outside. It was inside the house. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. I clutched the carving knife again, feeling utterly ridiculous and terrified all at once. My mind raced with possibilities. A prankster? A neighbor's kid? But deep down, I knew better. The laughter came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't just laughter. It was a child's laughter. The knife felt useless in my hand as I stepped cautiously toward the kitchen. My heart thudded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The radio had gone silent, leaving the house eerily quiet. The comforting smell of my dinner had been replaced by something acrid, something burnt. When I reached the kitchen, it was empty, but the atmosphere had shifted. The room felt darker, the shadows deeper. My gaze fell on the carving knife, which I had left on the counter. It was no longer there. I turned in a panic, scanning the room, and that's when I saw it. A small figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was no taller than a child, its outline blurry and indistinct, as if it were made of smoke. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. "Get out of my house," I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed toward the front door. I turned to look, and my stomach dropped. The door was wide open again, the snow outside undisturbed. When I turned back, the figure was gone. Panic overtook me. I grabbed my coat and keys, abandoning my dinner and my house without a second thought. I drove through the snowy streets to my daughter's home, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. When I arrived, I told her everything. She tried to comfort me, insisting it was just my imagination, perhaps a combination of loneliness and the stress of the holidays. But I knew better. That house wasn't empty. It hadn't been empty for a long time. I never went back after that night. My children helped me pack up my belongings over the next few weeks, but I refused to step foot inside the house again. They asked me why, but I could never give them a clear answer. How could I explain what I had seen, what I had felt? I later learned from a neighbor that the original owner of the house, a woman named Margaret, had lost her young son in a tragic accident on Christmas Eve decades ago. He had been playing near the front door when it swung open, causing him to fall down the icy steps and hit his head. He died instantly. I don't know if it was Margaret's son who opened the door that night, or if it was something else entirely. But I do know one thing: the laughter, the figure, the door. It wasn't my imagination. Some houses carry their history with them, their walls whispering secrets we were never meant to hear. And sometimes, those secrets don't stay buried. Story number 6. The wind chime at midnight. There's something about silence that makes you notice things you shouldn't. I used to love the quiet, especially around Christmas time. There's a calmness to it, an air of peace that's almost sacred. But that was before the night the silence betrayed me. It was Christmas Eve, 1993, and I was spending it alone in my house in Seattle. I wasn't upset about it. I'd lived alone for years and had grown used to the solitude. It was raining earlier that evening, but by the time I settled in front of the TV with a plate of leftover lasagna, the storm had subsided. The streets outside were damp, the air still and cold, the kind of crispness that makes your breath fog up the windows. The house was warm, the tree lights twinkling in the corner, and the sound of an old holiday movie crackling through the speakers. I remember thinking, this is enough. This is all I need tonight. I don't remember exactly when I first heard the chimes. I'd installed the wind chime by the front porch the previous summer, a cheap little decoration I'd picked up at a yard sale. It wasn't particularly attractive, metal tubes hanging from a cracked wooden frame, but the sound it made on breezy nights was soothing, almost meditative. But this night, there wasn't any breeze. The first chime was faint, a single note that barely registered. I thought it was my imagination and turned back to the TV. Then it came again, louder this time, a delicate clink of metal on metal. I muted the television, leaning forward in my chair. The house was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The chimes rang again, this time in a flurry, as if someone had run their fingers through them. I got up and went to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Outside, The world was still, no wind, no movement, nothing but the faint glow of my porch light illuminating the damp front yard. The wind chime swayed gently, as if something unseen had touched it. I opened the front door, the cold air hitting me like a slap. "Hello," I called out, my breath puffing white in the night. The chimes fell silent. There was no response, only the oppressive quiet of the neighborhood. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the yard and the street beyond. No one. The streetlights flickered faintly in the distance, their yellow glow pooling on the wet asphalt. I listened for footsteps, for the rustle of leaves, but there was nothing. "Damn wind," I muttered, even though I knew there wasn't any. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to shrug it off, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. I'm not a superstitious guy. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything like that. But as I sat back down in my chair, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The house felt different somehow, heavier. The chimes rang again. This time, the sound was sharper, more urgent, as if someone was shaking the whole frame. My stomach twisted. I got up and grabbed the fireplace poker before heading to the door again. This time, when I opened it, the chimes were completely still. Not a single tube swayed, not even a tremble. Something caught my eye then, a faint shadow that flitted across the yard. It was fast, almost too fast to register, like a flicker at the corner of my vision. I stepped back inside, shutting the door quickly and bolting it. My hands were shaking. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something. The air inside the house had grown cold. Unnaturally so. The warmth from the heater was gone, replaced by a chill that seeped into my bones. And then I saw it. There, on the mirror above the fireplace, were words scrawled in uneven handwriting. "Merry Christmas." My breath caught in my throat. The writing was wet, as if it had just been written, the letters glistening faintly in the dim light. I hadn't heard anyone come in. I hadn't heard anything at all. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the mirror. The poker in my hand felt useless, like a child's toy against something I couldn't see or fight. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The chimes rang again. This time, the sound was coming from inside the house. I turned toward the hallway leading to the back door. The chimes were louder now, more frantic, echoing down the corridor like a warning. I forced myself to move, gripping the poker tightly as I approached the sound. The hallway stretched out before me, the shadows seeming to grow darker with every step. When I reached the end of the hall, I froze. My wind chime, was hanging from the ceiling in the middle of the kitchen, swaying gently. I stared at it, my mind racing. How the hell had it gotten there? And then I noticed the air. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was freezing. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost was forming on the edges of the kitchen window. The chimes stopped suddenly, the silence deafening, and then I heard the whisper. It was faint at first, just a low murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the room. A cacophony of voices overlapping in a sinister harmony. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the frost on the window began to spread, the ice creeping inward like skeletal fingers. And on the glass, new words appeared, etched in the frost. "Get out." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, grabbing my keys and yanking the front door open. The air outside felt warm compared to the icy chill of the house. I didn't look back as I climbed into my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped down the driveway and into the night. I never went back to that house. I left everything behind, my furniture, my belongings, even the damn wind chime. I don't know what I encountered that night, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and still. I think I can hear it, the faint sound of chimes ringing in the distance, carried on a wind that doesn't exist. And every time I hear it, I remember the words on the mirror, the frost on the glass. Get out. Story number 7. The Watcher in the Corner. You never think about how quiet a place can get until you're alone in it. Real, soul-sucking quiet. The kind that crawls under your skin and makes you notice the tiniest noises, like the hum of the fluorescent light overhead or the subtle creak of floorboards as the building shifts in the cold. I was staying behind in the dorms during Christmas break. Everyone else had gone home to their families. But for me, going back wasn't an option. Home wasn't where the heart was. It was just a place filled with old arguments, the clinking of empty bottles, and the heavy weight of things better left unsaid. So, I stayed, alone. The dorm building was an old brick monstrosity, built sometime in the 1950s, with narrow hallways that always smelled faintly of mildew no matter how many times they scrubbed the floors. My room was on the 3rd floor, room 317, tucked at the end of a long corridor that felt like a tunnel when the lights flickered. It was Christmas Eve, and I'd spent the day curled up with a blanket, scrolling aimlessly on my laptop. I'd convinced myself it would be a peaceful night. No roommates blasting music. No loud conversations bleeding through the walls. Just me and the soothing hum of solitude. But solitude has a way of shifting, of turning into something else when you least expect it. Started around midnight. I was lying in bed, my laptop screen the only source of light in the room. The glow cast long shadows on the walls, and the silence pressed in around me like a heavy blanket. I was scrolling through some forum, half asleep, when I felt it. It was subtle at first, the kind of feeling you brush off as nothing, a faint prickling on the back of your neck, like someone standing behind you, but there was no one else there. I knew that. I was alone. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation. I closed the laptop, plunging the room into darkness. That's when I noticed it, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned my head toward the corner of the room. I couldn't see anything at first, just the faint outline of my desk and chair against the wall. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it, the figure. It was standing in the corner, where the shadows were deepest. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague outline of a person, tall and unmoving, its head tilted slightly as if it were watching me. I froze. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the light, that my eyes were playing games with me in the darkness. But no matter how hard I blinked, the figure didn't go away. "Hello!" My voice was barely a whisper. It didn't respond. It just stood there, silent and still, like a statue carved out of shadow. My hand fumbled for the lamp on my bedside table, my fingers trembling as I twisted the switch. Light flooded the room, chasing the shadows away, and the figure was gone. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the empty corner, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The room looked normal. My desk was exactly where I'd left it, the chair pushed neatly beneath it. There was nothing out of place. But I knew what I'd seen, and more than that, I knew what I'd felt. I didn't sleep after that. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that figure standing in the corner, watching me with unseen eyes. I kept the light on, my blanket pulled up to my chin like a child hiding from the monsters under the bed. Around 3 a.m., I finally convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd dozed off without realizing it. Maybe I'd had one of those vivid half-dreams that feel real but aren't. That was when I noticed the paper. It was sitting on my desk, a small rectangle of white against the dark wood. I knew for a fact it hadn't been there earlier. I would have seen it when I turned on the light. My heart sank as I got out of bed and approached the desk, my hands trembling as I reached for the note. The handwriting was messy, the letters slanted and uneven, as if written in a hurry. There were only 2 words, "Good night." My breath hitched, and I dropped the paper like it had burned me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. No one else had a key to my room. The door had been locked all night. There was no way anyone could have gotten in, unless they were already here. I packed my things in record time. By the time the sun rose, I was gone. The dorm room locked behind me as I drove to the nearest motel. I didn't care about the cost or the inconvenience. I just needed to get out. I never went back to that room. When the semester resumed, I requested a room transfer, making up some excuse about needing a quieter space to study. I didn't tell anyone the real reason. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed and the room is dark, I feel it again, that faint prickling on the back of my neck, that sense of being watched. And when I do, I can't help but glance toward the corner of the room, half expecting to see a shadow standing there. Because deep down, I know the truth. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't a dream. And no matter where I go, it's still watching me. Good night.